Hand her the dead gun. Let's see her squirm. A soldier sneered, and laughter rippled across the firing line. They expected weakness. Instead, she lifted the pistol with steady hands, checked the chamber, and met their laughter with silence. To them, Grace Duvall was just a clerk, an easy target for humiliation. But they don't know their prank lasted only seconds before the range fell quiet. When Grace raised the weapon, the laughter died. No bullets, no protest, only perfect control that froze every eye on the range. And when the first shot finally cracked the air, every man watching understood. Grace Duvall was no ordinary clerk. From that moment, nothing would ever be the same. The late morning sun hung over Fort Bragg's military firing range, painting the concrete benches and long rows of steel targets in harsh light. The air smelled of oil and gunpowder, punctuated by the sharp cracks of rifles echoing from neighboring lanes. Dust rose with each footstep, and the constant drone of cicadas underscored the routine chaos of soldiers at training. To outsiders, this scene might have looked orderly. Disciplined rows of uniforms, live weapons handled under strict protocols. But within the ranks, especially among the younger recruits, discipline often blurred with bravado. This was the proving ground where egos clashed, where weakness was sniffed out and ridiculed. And that morning, they had found an easy target, Grace Duvall. She didn't look like she belonged, not to them. Her neatly buttoned shirt, the kind worn by logistics and clerical staff, lacked the rugged edge of combat fatigues. Her boots, though service-issued, didn't carry the scuffs of endless field drills. And most damning of all, her presence at the firing line wasn't even official. Grace worked in supply and administration, her daily tasks buried in requisition forms, logistics reports, and endless stacks of paperwork that kept the base's engine running, but never earned battlefield glory. To the young soldiers around her, she was just an office clerk playing tourist on their ground. Corporal Harris was the first to notice her, a lean man with too much confidence for his experience. He leaned close to his buddy and muttered just loud enough for others to hear, "Look at that! Paperwork queen thinks she can shoot." The ripple of laughter that followed wasn't kind. Recruits exchanged smirks, some nudged each other with elbows, eager for entertainment. They had all felt the sting of being corrected on the range, of instructors barking at them for mistakes. Now the thought of someone from admin fumbling in front of them promised relief from their own insecurities. Master Sergeant Cole, the range instructor overseeing the session, noticed too. A man hardened by years of training cycles, Cole had seen plenty of support staff wander too close to the combat training they weren't meant to touch. Normally, he would have dismissed her presence outright, sent her back to her desk with a wave of authority. But that morning, amusement got the better of him. With a sly grin, he reached for one of the Beretta M9 pistols lined up on the bench. He slid it forward across the concrete, the weapon deliberately stripped of magazine and rounds. Its polished steel gleamed under the sun, but it was nothing more than a prop. Dead weight meant to humiliate. "Here you go, Duvall," Cole said, his voice carrying the kind of mocking hospitality that was more trap than offer. "Why don't you show us what you've got?" The words fell heavy, laced with sarcasm. Grace didn't flinch. She didn't answer either. The silence seemed to irritate Harris more than anything. He barked a laugh, gesturing theatrically toward the pistol. "Go on, clerk, pick it up. Let's see if you even know which end the bullets come out of." The other recruits roared with laughter. Someone in the back mimed firing finger guns, muttering, "Bang, bang," like a child at play. Another added, "Maybe she'll file a report on how heavy it is." It wasn't just mockery, it was a pack mentality, the sort of casual cruelty that thrives when groups single out someone they think can't fight back. Cole leaned on the bench, folding his arms. "Consider this a lesson," he said, more to the recruits than to Grace. "Combat isn't about forms and supply logs. Let's show her what separates soldiers from clerks." That was the expectation. Grace would stammer, fumble with the weapon, maybe even hold it wrong. She would provide a moment of comic relief before being dismissed. The men wanted to see cracks, signs that confirmed their belief that she didn't belong. Grace Duvall stood quietly for a moment, her gaze fixed not on the recruits or even on Cole, but on the pistol itself. The jeers washed over her like background noise, as meaningless as static. Then, without a word, she stepped forward. Her hand reached out, calm, deliberate, precise. The laughter spiked in anticipation. Harris whispered to the soldier beside him, "She's gonna drop it. Watch." But she didn't drop it. She didn't hesitate. She picked it up with a natural grip, her fingers sliding into place, as though they had been there countless times before. She checked the chamber automatically, even though everyone knew it was empty. The small, efficient movement silenced a few chuckles, though most were too caught up in their own expectations to notice. Grace raised the weapon slowly, aligning it with the range ahead. The recruits leaned in, some grinning wider, waiting for the awkward fumbling that surely must come. But it didn't. Instead, her posture straightened. Her stance shifted ever so slightly, and her arms extended with practiced precision. The pistol didn't wobble, not even under the weight of stillness. Cole's grin faltered just a fraction. He had trained thousands of recruits. He knew the difference between someone pretending and someone moving with muscle memory. There was nothing random about her movements. And in that moment, with the midday sun burning overhead and the mocking laughter still echoing faintly, the atmosphere at the firing line began to shift. The prank had been set, the trap laid with cruel intentions. But what none of them realized, not Harris, not Cole, not any of the recruits, was that the so-called joke had already started to unravel. Grace Duvall was no ordinary clerk, and the lesson they were about to learn would echo far beyond that firing range. The laughter swelled like a wave as Grace Duvall brought the pistol up, the soldiers practically tripping over themselves in their eagerness to watch her humiliation. Their amusement wasn't quiet or hidden. It was loud, sharp, meant to sting. In their eyes, she was a desk worker pretending to step into a world she couldn't possibly understand. But then something strange happened. Grace didn't stammer. She didn't hesitate. She didn't even look embarrassed. Her movements were smooth, deliberate. She adjusted her stance, left foot slightly forward, right foot anchoring behind for balance. Her shoulders squared, her elbows locked into position, and the pistol leveled with the target downrange as though it were an extension of her body. Her finger rested not on the trigger, but along the frame, the mark of someone drilled into the fundamentals of safe handling. It wasn't the clumsy grip of an amateur. It was perfect. The laughter stuttered. Corporal Harris smirked louder, trying to keep the momentum alive. "Look at her! She doesn't even realize it's empty," he jeered. A few soldiers joined in with forced chuckles, but they sounded thinner now, more uncertain. Grace remained silent. Her breathing slowed, her chest rising and falling in a measured rhythm. The recruits had expected her to panic, to make excuses, maybe even to put the pistol down. Instead, she began to move through the motions of dry fire practice. She aligned the sights with the paper target 50 meters away, her arms rock steady. She pressed the trigger, click. A sharp mechanical snap echoed faintly, loud only because she had made the world around her so quiet. No bullets, no recoil. Just the discipline of perfect repetition. She reset her grip, realigned her sights, and squeezed again. Click. Her motions were fluid, practiced, too practiced. Every time she cycled through the drill, it carried the unmistakable rhythm of someone who had done this thousands of times before. Sight picture, breath, trigger squeeze, reset, over and over, crisp as clockwork. The recruit's laughter faltered, thinning into a confused murmur. One of the older sergeants watching from behind the line tilted his head, frowning. Dry fire drills weren't common for casual shooters. They were the bread and butter of serious marksmen who valued fundamentals above bravado. The way Grace executed them was textbook, and then some. Harris forced another laugh, his voice rising almost defensively. "What's she doing? Playing make-believe? It's empty, for God's sake." But no one joined him this time. Grace kept going, her silence becoming louder than any insult. Every click was like a hammer striking against the recruit's pride. Her focus never wavered, not even when someone muttered another half-hearted joke. Her face betrayed nothing. No smile, no smugness, only calm control. And then she did something that made the air itself seem to stop. On the concrete bench beside her lay a discarded brass casing, glinting faintly in the sunlight. Grace set the pistol down, picked up the casing between two fingers, and with careful precision, balanced it on the front sight post of the Beretta. The recruits blinked, confused. Harris snorted. What the hell is that supposed to prove? But the veterans in the crowd went silent. Grace lifted the pistol again, raising it to eye level. The casing wobbled for a fraction of a second, then went still, and it stayed still. The firing line, once roaring with laughter, now held its breath. Everyone knew the natural tremor of human muscles, the slight shake in any shooter's arms when holding a weapon steady. But Grace's pistol didn't move. It was a statue, a steel extension of her will. 10 seconds passed, then 20. The casing didn't fall. The silence grew heavy, pressing down on every soldier present. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Grace's eyes locked down range, unblinking, her control absolute. 30 seconds. Still the casing stayed. For those who understood, it was terrifying. This wasn't parlor trick precision. It was the mark of someone who had trained to eliminate every involuntary movement, every breath-induced sway, every flicker of instability. Holding a pistol perfectly motionless under that kind of strain was a skill reserved for elite marksmen, the kind whose missions depended on a single shot under impossible conditions. A low murmur rippled through the older ranks, the kind who had seen deployments, who had worked with specialized units. They recognized what they were looking at. Sergeant First Class Ramirez, a grizzled sniper instructor with a scar along his jaw, stepped forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. Unlike the others, he wasn't laughing, wasn't confused. He was remembering. He had seen this before. Not here, not in basic qualification ranges, but out in hostile valleys and rooftops where mistakes meant death. He whispered under his breath, almost reverently, "That's operator training." The recruits nearby turned to him, startled. Ramirez didn't look away from Grace. His gaze was sharp, his voice certain. "That woman isn't practicing. She's demonstrating." At that moment, the casing finally toppled, bouncing off the bench with a faint metallic ping. But it didn't matter. The point had already been made. The recruits stared, their mockery swallowed whole by disbelief. Harris opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came. He couldn't laugh anymore. Grace lowered the pistol, rechecked the chamber, and reset her stance. Her face remained impassive, but her silence screamed louder than any lecture. The atmosphere of the range had changed. The prank, once meant to humiliate, had flipped entirely. Now the soldiers were the ones being tested, not Grace. Master Sergeant Cole's smirk had faded, replaced with a look of unease. He had set up the joke, confident it would prove a lesson in the limits of clerks and administrators. Instead, he found himself watching a demonstration that exceeded the form of most recruits under his command. The silence at the range was no longer awkward. It was reverent, almost fearful. Grace Duvall hadn't fired a single bullet. She hadn't spoken a single word. But in less than 5 minutes, she had silenced an entire firing line. And somewhere deep inside, the veterans knew the truth. This was no ordinary woman from the supply office. The silence at the range was suffocating. The laughter, once a roaring wave, had collapsed into uneasy stillness. Grace Duvall still stood at the firing line, pistol in hand, her expression calm, her posture perfect. She hadn't fired a single live round, yet somehow she had silenced an entire platoon of recruits. Master Sergeant Cole cleared his throat. The sound was sharp, almost jarring against the heavy quiet. His smirk had long faded, replaced by something harder to define. Curiosity, unease, a flicker of professional respect he didn't want to admit. Whatever it was, the prank had spun out of his control. He reached into his pouch deliberately, letting the soldiers see what he held, a single 9mm round. The brass casing glinted in the sunlight, simple but suddenly heavy with meaning. "All right, Duvall," Cole said, his voice lower, less mocking now. "Dry fire is one thing, but let's see if you can back it up." He slid the lone bullet across the concrete bench toward her. The metallic scrape echoed louder than it should have, like a challenge being etched into stone. Every soldier leaned in, their eyes glued to the tiny object. They knew what this meant. One bullet, one chance. If she fumbled, if she missed, the laughter would return tenfold. This was the make-or-break moment. Grace didn't hesitate. She picked up the round with steady fingers, inspected it briefly, then loaded it into the chamber with the kind of practiced precision that stripped away any doubt. She had done this before. A press check, a quick safety glance, and then the weapon was ready. She drew a slow, controlled breath. Then she raised the pistol. The range was so silent now that even the cicadas seemed to pause. 100 eyes locked on her as she aligned the sights with the paper target 50 meters away. Not a tremor, not a flicker of doubt crossed her face. And then, crack! The shot tore through the air, sharp and decisive. The recoil jolted her arm slightly, absorbed flawlessly through her stance. A puff of dust lifted from the berm beyond the target, and the spent casing ejected cleanly, spinning in a perfect arc before clattering to the ground. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then Cole's assistant jogged forward to check the target. When he turned back, his eyes were wide. He raised the paper high so everyone could see. A single hole, dead center. Bullseye. The silence deepened, but now it wasn't disbelief. It was awe. Grace didn't smile, didn't bask in the stunned expressions around her. She simply lowered the pistol, cleared the chamber, and set the weapon down with professional care, as though hitting the absolute center was routine, nothing more than a confirmation of skill she already knew she possessed. Cole's jaw tightened. He wasn't satisfied yet. One shot, no matter how perfect, could always be dismissed as luck, and yet deep down he already knew the truth. Still, procedure demanded proof. Wordlessly, he reached into his pouch again and withdrew a loaded magazine. 3 rounds this time. He placed it on the bench with quiet finality. The challenge was implicit. Grace didn't blink. She picked up the magazine, slid it into place, racked the slide, and brought the weapon back up. Her every movement was precise, disciplined, efficient. She exhaled slowly, locked onto the target, and fired. Crack. 2 seconds passed. Crack. 2 seconds. Crack. Each shot echoed in a steady rhythm, neither rushed nor hesitant. She didn't chase speed, didn't need to prove aggression. She shot with the confidence of someone who knew that accuracy mattered more than bravado. When the echoes faded, the range was frozen once more. The assistant jogged forward again, snatched the target from its frame, and turned back with trembling hands. He didn't need to hold it high this time. The whole grouping was obvious. 3 perfect strikes in the center ring, so close together they could be covered with a quarter. The recruits gasped. A few muttered curses under their breath, unable to process what they were seeing. Harris, the loudest mocker moments before, stood pale and silent, his earlier grin gone as though it had never existed. Sergeant Ramirez, the sniper instructor, stepped closer, his voice carrying the weight of recognition. "That's not luck, that's training." The recruits turned to him, desperate for an explanation. Ramirez's gaze stayed on Grace, his tone reverent. "I've seen that grouping before. Not here. Not in basic. Out there." He didn't have to say where out there was. Everyone understood he meant combat zones, missions the rest of them would never read about in official reports. Grace lowered the pistol again, cleared it, and placed it neatly on the bench. She didn't acknowledge the whispers, the stares, the sudden shift in atmosphere. She just stepped back, her silence saying more than words ever could. Master Sergeant Cole didn't move for a long moment. His eyes locked on the target, the 3 clustered holes staring back like undeniable proof. His hand, once so quick to set up a joke, now clenched slowly into a fist at his side, not in anger, but in reluctant respect. Finally, he broke the silence. "Range is clear." His voice wasn't mocking anymore. It was steady, clipped, almost formal. The recruits shuffled uneasily, their earlier bravado extinguished. Not one of them dared laugh now. Not one of them met Grace's eyes as she walked past, calm and composed, leaving behind an empty pistol that suddenly felt heavier than when it had no bullets at all. The lesson was clear. Grace Duvall wasn't just an office clerk. She had just demonstrated the kind of skill that most of them could only dream of mastering. And as the whispers began to spread, every soldier knew the truth. This was no ordinary woman. The echoes of Grace Duvall's final shot still hung in the air long after the target was pulled from the frame. 3 holes impossibly close, clustered in the bullseye. The recruits who had been so eager for a show now stood stiff and silent. The only sounds were the faint clink of brass casings cooling on concrete and the distant drone of the wind moving through the Carolina pines. What had begun as a prank had transformed into something far heavier. For a few seconds, no one dared speak. Then from the back of the crowd, a low murmur broke the silence. That's, that's not basic. The voice belonged to an older sergeant, one of the range assistants who had spent years qualifying recruits. He wasn't smiling. His eyes followed Grace as she holstered the pistol, her movements fluid, efficient, without a hint of wasted energy. Others began to whisper too, quiet at first, then louder as the realization spread. She didn't learn that in admin. That's not range qualification form. I've seen that kind of grouping before, but not here. The younger soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, confused. But the veterans, those who had spent years overseas, who had worked alongside shadow units and seen things never written in reports, knew better. They didn't need long explanations. A look was enough. Sergeant First Class Ramirez stepped forward again, the scar on his jaw catching the sunlight. His eyes were fixed on Grace, narrowing in recognition. He had seen countless shooters, rookies, marksmen, even competitors. But there was something about her cadence, her breathing, her control. It wasn't just accuracy, it was discipline forged under pressure, under conditions where a missed shot meant lives lost. He spoke quietly, but the words carried, "I've seen that style, in places no official record will ever mention." Heads turned toward him. The recruits looked baffled, but the older NCOs understood. Ramirez didn't exaggerate, and he didn't hand out respect lightly. Another veteran muttered, "Special operations. Has to be." The phrase rippled like electricity through the crowd. Special operations. Elite units. The kind of training most soldiers only heard about in rumors. Corporal Harris, who had been the loudest voice of mockery minutes earlier, now stood pale and silent, his eyes darting nervously between the target and Grace. His mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. Grace, for her part, remained utterly still. She didn't acknowledge the whispers, didn't offer any explanation or denial. She simply reset the pistol on the bench, safety engaged, barrel pointed neatly downrange. Her expression was unreadable, calm, composed, as if the entire demonstration had been nothing more than routine. That silence spoke louder than any confirmation. Cole, the master sergeant who had initiated the lesson, found himself at a loss. He had intended to embarrass her, to draw a line between combat soldiers and clerical staff. Instead, he had inadvertently revealed that Grace's competence outstripped many of his own recruits. He studied her now with new eyes, replaying her every motion. The stance, the grouping, the casing balanced on the front sight, none of it belonged to an amateur. But she gave him nothing. No smile, no gloat, no anger. It was the silence of someone used to keeping secrets. And in the military, everyone knew that kind of silence. It was the same silence you heard from soldiers whose files were locked under clearance levels you'd never see. The same silence carried by operators who vanished from the barracks for weeks, returning without explanation, their eyes a little older, their words a little fewer. One of the younger recruits finally whispered the thought on everyone's mind. Who is she really? No one answered. Ramirez's gaze didn't waver. He spoke again, but softer this time, as if to himself. That's not the silence of someone who doesn't know. That's the silence of someone who's not allowed to tell. The words settled over the range like a shadow. The recruits shifted uneasily, realizing just how badly they had misjudged her. The prank had lasted mere seconds, but the lesson would last much longer. Grace finally stepped back from the firing line. Her pace was steady, unhurried. The crowd instinctively parted, leaving a clear path for her to walk through. No one dared block her way. No one dared meet her eyes. She passed between them like a ghost, her presence undeniable, yet untouchable. Still, she didn't speak. She didn't need to. By the time she disappeared from the range, the whispers had already taken on a life of their own. Some said she must have been attached to special forces. Others swore she had the bearing of an operator who had served in places no one admitted existed. A few simply shook their heads, muttering that some pasts weren't meant to be questioned. In the end, it didn't matter which rumor was true. What mattered was the lesson burned into every soldier who had witnessed it. Assumptions could be deadly, and respect was earned not through words, but through action. Grace Duvall had given them no explanations. She had left them only with silence. And silence, they realized, could be the loudest answer of all. The last echo of gunfire had faded, but no one at the range moved. The paper target still fluttered faintly in the warm Carolina breeze. 3 holes clustered so tightly at the center that even the greenest recruit could see the truth. Grace Duvall was no ordinary clerk. For a long moment, the silence stretched. Soldiers shifted uneasily, as though afraid to break it. Then from the range tower, a firm voice cut through the still air. Brigadier General Whitaker had been watching the entire display from above, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Now he leaned toward the microphone, his words carrying across every lane, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "What you just witnessed," he said, his tone sharp, deliberate, "is how a professional handles a weapon, with discipline, respect, and skill earned, not assumed." The words landed with the weight of an order. Every soldier, from the cocky recruits to the seasoned instructors, straightened reflexively. Whitaker's presence alone commanded silence, but his acknowledgement of Grace's performance drove the lesson deeper than any reprimand could. "Remember this," he continued. "Rank, title, or assignment do not define competence. Assumptions are dangerous. Skill speaks for itself." Then he stepped back, ending his commentary with a final statement that seemed to settle into the bones of everyone listening. "This is the way a true professional carries a firearm." No one dared argue. The recruits returned to their positions, but the atmosphere had shifted completely. The casual laughter and bravado that had filled the morning were gone. Every soldier now adjusted their stance more carefully, checked their grip with greater focus, and studied their targets with a seriousness born from humility. Grace had turned the range into a classroom, and her silence had become the lesson plan. Master Sergeant Cole, who had once grinned at the idea of a prank, now barked instructions with a new edge. He corrected posture, emphasized breathing, and drilled into the recruits the very fundamentals Grace had displayed moments before. It wasn't embarrassment that drove him now. It was respect. Even he, a hardened instructor, had been reminded that the basics, executed with mastery, separated the careless from the competent. By the end of the session, no one joked. No one smirked. What lingered instead was a quiet determination, as though every soldier understood they had just been measured against a standard they had not even known existed. That evening, the story of the clerk at the range spread through Fort Bragg with the speed of wildfire. But unlike most barracks gossip, it wasn't told with sneers or embellishments. There were no exaggerated failures or humiliations to laugh about. Instead, it carried a note of awe. Recruits who had witnessed the event told others about the impossible stillness of her aim, about the casing balanced on the pistol, about the 3 shots that could be covered with a coin. Veterans added their own commentary, explaining in hushed tones what those techniques meant, hinting at backgrounds that were never officially acknowledged. By nightfall, Grace Duvall had become more than a name. She was a story, an unspoken reminder whispered in the mess hall and the barracks. Never underestimate the quiet ones. The lesson wasn't about her rank, her uniform, or her job title. It was about respect, about the truth that real strength doesn't need to announce itself. That sometimes the most powerful response to ridicule isn't anger or protest, but silence followed by undeniable action. Grace never confirmed who she had been before, never explained where she had learned what she knew. She didn't need to. Her demonstration had spoken louder than any admission. And so, long after the casings had been swept away and the targets replaced, her presence remained. Every soldier who had been there carried the memory with them. The moment their laughter turned to silence, the moment they saw competence revealed where they least expected it, it was no longer just a story of a prank gone wrong. It had become a parable, a reminder repeated in training sessions and whispered during late-night conversations. Respect what you don't understand, because true strength doesn't shout, it shows. And for those who had stood on the range that day, one truth was undeniable. Grace Duvall had proven that the greatest authority comes not from words, but from the precision of action. The story of Grace Duvall is more than a tale about a single morning at a firing range. It is in many ways a mirror held up to the world we live in today. In our daily lives, whether in workplaces, schools, or even within our own families, how often do we dismiss people because of appearances, job titles, or assumptions? How often do we laugh too quickly, judge too harshly, and realize only later that the quietest person in the room may carry the deepest strength? Grace's silence was not weakness, it was discipline. Her precision was not for applause, it was the mark of mastery, and that lesson resonates far beyond Fort Bragg. In modern America, where noise often drowns out substance, her story reminds us that true professionalism, whether with a rifle, in a classroom, or behind a desk, comes not from words but from consistent, humble action. For veterans and older generations, perhaps Grace's composure echoes something familiar. The quiet dignity of those who served without fanfare, who carried skill and sacrifice without demanding recognition. For younger viewers, it is a challenge to remember that character is proven when the spotlight is least expected, and respect is owed even to those we think we understand the least. And maybe that's where the debate begins. Should we, as a culture, value words as much as we do action? Should silent excellence always speak for itself? Or is there a place for recognition, for stepping forward and letting others know who we truly are? Some will argue Grace should have revealed her past. Others will say her silence is what made her unforgettable. What do you think? Was her greatest power the bullet she fired? Or the words she never spoke? I'd love to hear your perspective. Share your thoughts in the comments below, because these stories are not just about the past, they're about the lessons we carry forward into our own lives. Thank you for listening to Grace's story. If it touched you, if it made you pause and reflect, please give this video a like, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe for more stories of silent strength and hidden courage. Because sometimes the loudest message is the one spoken without a word.